just for our records. And we just ask you to remain on mute while Bernice is presenting her work to us. But afterwards, especially with a small intimate group like this, we're going to invite you to unmute yourself and ask questions or make comments or just engage with our speakers tonight. So that'll be wonderful. So just to formally introduce Bernice Steinhardt, sorry, she is the president of Art and Remembrance, which is a nonprofit arts and educational organization. In founding Art and Remembrance, Bernice and her sister Helene McQuaid were inspired by the art and story of their mother, Esther Nisenthal Krinitz, a Holocaust survivor, and I'm sure she'll tell us more about her mother's story. But recognizing the power of their mother's art, they created Art and Remembrance as a testament to their mother's legacy and as a means to share her work and those of others who depicted their experiences as victims of war, oppression, and injustice. Since its founding in 2003, the organization has created a traveling exhibit of Esther Krinitz art, which has traveled to close to 24 museums in the United States. And it's produced an award-winning film, Through the Eye of the Needle, and published the book, Memories of Survival. So I'm going to hand over to you, Bernice, and a very warm welcome from us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And what a thrill it is to be able to join you from halfway around the world. I'm in the United States, just outside of Washington, D.C. So this is really an amazing connection here. It is also a great honor for me to be able to share something of the art and story of my late mother, Esther Nisenthal Krinitz, and to show you something of her life. My mother, unlike most other Holocaust survivors, always shared her story with us. But when she was about 50, she decided she wanted us to see what her home and her family looked like. My mother grew up in a tiny village in the center of Poland called Nishik. And she was 12 years old when the war started and the Germans invaded Poland. And they came straight to her village. And they occupied it for 3 years until 1942, when they ordered all the Jews of that whole region to report to a nearby train station. My mother refused to go. She was 15 at the time, she took her 13-year-old sister, and the two of them said goodbye to their family, and they never saw them again. So I heard these stories, obviously many more stories all my life. Really, I don't remember when I didn't know my mother's story. But when she was about 50, she wanted, as I said before, she wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. She had never been trained in art. She didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. She had been apprenticed to a dressmaker as a little girl. So she took a piece of fabric and sketched out her house and her family and filled it in with stitches. And ultimately, she went on to create a series of 36 pretty large scale fabric embroidery and collage tapestries that tell the story of her childhood, her life during the war, her survival during the war, and ultimately her arrival in the United States. So this evening, I'm going to share with you a short clip, really the introduction to a film that we produced, which features interviews with my mother. So you will get to meet Esther. And after the film, which is about 2.5 minutes, we'll come back and I'll show you some slides, some images of works, and talk about them for a while. And then after that, we can do a question and answer. Before we move on, though, I wanted to just introduce and give a shout out to Cecile Lipworth, who actually helped bring this program to you this evening. Cecile is from South Africa, and I think her family or some members of her family may be joining us for this evening as well. But Cecile will come back later in the program, and she can tell us more about her connection to art and remembrance and Esther as well. So let's begin with the video clip if we can.
I always thought of my mother as different from other mothers. She sounded different from other mothers. She pronounced words differently, and she had a past that other mothers didn't have.
She loved to sew, she loved to embroider, she loved creating beautiful things. Our mother was very driven to tell the story. She wanted us to know it, she wanted us to remember.
It was a way of connecting me and my sister with the family that she had lost. Her mother, her father, her sisters, her brother, nearly everyone that she loved in the world. At some point, she really began to look to me to be the storyteller. I had just read The Diary of Anne Frank, which came out around then. And so I started writing it. But I knew even then that nobody could really tell my mother's story. It was her story to tell.
I wanted to show my kids how I grew up. And I was trying desperately, but I never drew anything in my life. I said, well, I'm gonna try. So I bought this piece of cheap fabric. I thought I was just gonna mess around with. And I took a ruler, and I still see my house the way it was. And I just drew the lines, and then I started filling it out with acrylic work. And then I made this straw roof, sort of. Now, when I finished the house, I was really satisfied the way it looked. That's the way it looked.
And once she found that way, it just poured out of her.
So I'm assuming you can all see me and hear me. I just wanted to encourage you to watch the full, which is 30 minutes long. It's available on our website, artandremembrance.org, and I think we'll have the URL for the website in the chat box. It's a beautiful film, as you might have gathered. So again, I would encourage you to take a look at it. Now I want to just give you some more of my mother's story in talking about some of the pictures that she created. Although a lot of her story is about her survival, she really wanted us to see, as I said earlier, her home and family, and that's where she began creating her pictures. So if we can start with the first slide, please. This was the very first picture that she created, and it's quite large. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And you can see it has a very, in artistic terms, a very naive quality. She didn't know perspective, how to render perspective at this point, but she created such beauty in this picture. She appears in the lower left-hand corner of the picture. She's carrying water up from the river on a pair of buckets across her back. Her sister is waiting for her. Her sister Manya is waiting for her at the top of the hill. Her mother and the 2 younger girls are there, her father, her brother, the dog, the horse, the neighbor's house. It's just a very beautiful scene. Next slide, please. After she finished that picture, she gave it to me, and then she made a companion piece for my sister, which was sort of the view from the other side. She and her brother are swimming in the river. Her sisters are standing by the river banks. The cows are grazing, the ducks and chickens. And this one, she filled in completely with stitches. There's not a piece of underlying fabric that you can see at all. So she did these 2 pictures, and then she set aside these memory pictures for about 10 years. She was busy making things for my kids. She was running a business also. My mother had a women's clothing store. So her life was very busy, but about 10 years later, she decided to go back to these memory pictures, and then began the constant stream of pictures after that. If we can go to the next slide. This is actually very timely. This is a scene from Shavuos of 1938. And I think yesterday was the first day of Shavuos. I'm not sure, but I know we're in Shavuos now. And this was Shavuos then. And my mother remembered that she and her brother and sisters were going to their grandparents' house. And her brother had made a pair of stilts. My mother used to say that her brother was the toy maker and she was the toy tester. So here she got to try out this pair of stilts, and she walked through the fields all the way to her grandparents' house on the stilts without ever falling, and surrounded by the fields of wheat along the sides. She loved this motif of wheat so much that she continued it into the border of the picture, which was the only picture that she did which had embroidery other than a caption, which had embroidery all around the border. But I love all of the pictures my mother did, but I especially love the vividness of the colors in this picture and the exuberance of the stitching. And what I also love is the way my mother remembered herself as standing head and shoulders above her brother and sisters, and she's leading the way. And it spoke so much of her, to her character. If we can go to the next slide. You can see the detail, the exquisite stitching of the wheat and the cornflowers, the blue cornflowers interspersed. And of course, my mother's braids. Next slide, please. This is now the arrival of war in the village. My mother had heard that there was a small group of German soldiers who had come into the village. So she and a couple of her friends went to her grandparents' house to see, because her grandparents' house was at the entrance to the village. And as she watched, one of the German soldiers dismounted from his horse and pulled her grandfather off the steps of his house and cut off his beard. Because only Jewish men at that time wore beards. Polish men did not. So to have a beard was the kind of insignia of the Jewish religion. So it was the sign of great disdain, of great disrespect, that the soldier cut off her grandfather's beard. Next slide, please. And this is the way that the war began for my mother. Next slide, please. This is now in July of 1940. One day my mother had developed this terrible toothache, and she had heard that there was a dentist in the German camp. And so she wanted to go see him, but she knew she couldn't go as herself, as a Jewish girl. She could speak a little German, but she knew her Yiddish accent would give her away. So she got one of her Polish friends to go with her, and she taught her how to say in German, "My sister has a toothache." So here she sits while the dentist pulls her tooth, after which he gave her a piece of chocolate, presumably because she was a good patient. And then she went home and told her mother what she had done. She didn't tell her mother what she was planning to do, because she knew that if she had told her mother would have forbidden her to go. And in fact, when she told her mother what she had done, her mother was shocked. She said she was shocked that my mother had had the nerve to do this. And years later, when my mother would tell this story, she was shocked that she had had the nerve to do it. But she was just so desperate. She was in pain and she was desperate. And she needed to do something to relieve her pain. And yet this is kind of a foreshadowing of what she went on to do in order to save her life. Next slide, please. The good patient. Next slide, please. As I said before, I loved all of the pictures, but when I saw this picture, when my mother finished it, because I was watching all of these works in progress, when she finished it and I saw it, I was literally awestruck. Somehow my mother captured the reality of war so incredibly in this picture. This is now in June of 1941. And by this point, the Jews were no longer allowed to own livestock, and which was a real cataclysm in her family. Her father was a horse trader. He traveled around the countryside buying and selling horses. Her mother raised poultry to sell at the market. So they were no longer allowed to practice earn their livelihood. So my mother and her sister, the two oldest girls, went to work for Polish farmers as farmhands, just helping them. And here my mother and her sister are tending another farmer's cows. And because it was such a beautiful day, they decided to take them down to the Vistula River, to the good pasture there. But once they got there, my mother could see through the trees that they were next to this place called Yanishev camp, which had been a prison camp before the war. They brought Polish prisoners there to rebuild an earthen dam, which would get washed out in spring floods. So here, though, the Germans had turned it into a slave labor camp for young Jewish men and boys. And you can see the whips and the guns. And my mother could see this as she looked through the trees, what was going on. And she watched, if we could have the next slide. She watched as one of the soldiers led a young boy into the forest who was too exhausted to work anymore. And there she heard shots ring out. So if we go back, can we go back to the previous slide? I thought my mother captured the essence of war from the perspective of one of its victims in this picture. On the one side is the beauty of life on a beautiful day in June. The trees are blooming, the flowers are blooming, the grass is so lush. Every single blade of grass my mother stitched by hand in this picture. But on the other side is the brutality and terror of war. And my mother figured out a way intuitively to capture this dichotomy in this one scene. And a few years ago, I did a program for a group of very talented, smart 9 and 10-year-olds, and I asked them what this picture, I showed them this picture, and I asked them what they thought about it. And one boy raised his hand and he said, "This picture tells me that there's a thin line between good and evil." I think it says it all. Next slide, please. This is the morning of October 15th, 1942. Things had grown progressively worse during the occupation, and by this point, families were living through considerable episodes of terror. But on October 15th, the Germans ordered all the Jews to leave their homes by 10 a.m. If anyone was found in their home after that, they would be shot. And they were ordered to report to a train station in the city of Krasnik, not terribly far away. The night before, my mother said she cried all night. She refused to go. No one knew exactly where they were going to go or what was going to happen to them. But after living under German occupation for 3 years, they knew it wasn't going to be good. My mother begged her father to think of someone they could go to, a friend of his, a Pole, for whom they could go to work, just as they had been working for Polish farmers earlier. So finally, her father thought of the friend of his named Stefan, who lived in a nearby village called Dąbrowa. So this is the morning that they said goodbye to their family. And everybody is crying in this picture. And the next picture, please. Here you can see they're taking with them layers and layers of clothing and the baskets they had packed with some food and their tools for digging, for working. Next slide. I wanted to show you this picture. This is also a picture of leave taking. In the picture I just showed you, my mother used to say that that was the hardest picture that she did, not technically, but emotionally, just recalling the memory of the last time that she saw her family. But 10 years later, so that was one of the first pictures she did, and this was one of the last pictures that she did. She returned to this scene of farewell, but in this picture, she and Manya are small figures receding into the background, and it's her parents who are in the foreground, as they leave their home. Her brother is standing next to one of the wagons, and the little sisters are in the wagon already. And so she's remembering this scene, not through her own eyes, but what she imagined it must have looked like from her parents, for her parents, as they sent off two of their children and were now going with the rest to what seemed likely to be their deaths. Next picture, please. As it turned out, their mother had paid a neighbor to take them to Stefan's house in Dąbrowa, but she abandoned them. And so they joined the rest of the Jews on the road to Krasnik. These were the Jews from the whole town and nearby area. When they saw their cousin Dina, Manya, my mother's sister, just wanted to stay with Dina. She had never wanted to go with Esther. She wanted to stay with the rest of their family. And it was only because their mother urged Manya to go with Esther that she listened. My mother really wanted to have Manya come with her. She was very daring to do this, but she wasn't daring enough to do it alone. She knew she needed a companion. But at this point on the road, my mother realized that they were soon going to be in Krasnik, and she balked. She didn't want to go any further. She wanted to leave the road to go to Dąbrowa, to Stefan's house. And she started tugging on Manya. And it wasn't until their cousin Dina said, Manya, go with Esther, that Manya listened and the two of them went. So I have said that my aunt survived, Manya survived because she listened, and my mother survived because she didn't. Next slide, please. The fabric of the two girls' dresses came from I think my mother made scarves from them, but at any rate, she saved these pieces of fabric because she used them for continuity in all of the pictures that take place in the same period of time. She was very, very conscious of telling a story, and she wanted to have the continuity of appearance, including the clothes that Manya and Esther were wearing. Next slide, please. So here they are, having arrived at Stefan's house in Dąbrowa. And when he comes to the door, they throw themselves into his arms and they tell him, we're Hersch's daughters, please help us. And he reassures them that they can stay with him, and he puts them up into his attic where they're stringing tobacco leaves. And after a couple of days, when they come down for breakfast, they see their baskets are already packed, and he's going to send them out. And he tells them, he says, everybody in Mniszek knows you came to me. If the Germans come here, they will kill you, they will kill me, they'll burn down my farm. You have to leave. So off they go in the pouring rain, and they wander down the path until they come to the forest. And they hide in the forest until the rain stops. Here they're hanging their boots up to dry in the trees. And this is when my mother realizes that they cannot survive as Hersch's daughters anymore. And so she makes up these new identities for them as these Polish Catholic farm girls. The story is that they come from another town on the other side of the Vistula River called Chizov. She had heard her father talking about this place. And the story was that their family had been displaced from their farm by these so-called Volksdeutsch, these ethnic Germans. And they were separated from their family, and they were looking for work. And she had names too. They were Josefina Grochowiecka and Maria Grochowiecka. So with these names and these stories, they went first to one village, then to another village, and people were not willing to take them in until they could see papers, proof of their identity. So they had to leave until they finally came to this village called Grabówka, where people were willing to take them in without papers. If you could go to the next slide, please. My mother found work with this elderly farmer who treated her really well because, of course, she was a really good housekeeper too. And she called him Dziadek, in fact, which is the Polish word for grandfather. And he's standing there next to the house when one day these two German soldiers trampled the garden where which my mother had planted. And they were trying to talk to her. And of course, she had to pretend she didn't understand them. She kept her head down and tried so hard to just disengage from them. When all of a sudden the bees that the farmer kept, you can see the beehives at the top of the picture, they started swarming and out of the beehives and came over to the soldiers and started swarming around their heads. And they kept asking, why aren't they stinging you? And finally, the bees drove them off and they left. So my mother used to say that that was the day that the bees saved her. This tiny miracle of the bee drove off these soldiers when no one else could. Next slide, please. I just want you to see the perfection of these bees. I couldn't get over how perfectly my mother stitched them. And in the full picture, you can see the beehives are filled with bees. And now here they are swarming around the soldiers' heads, but they're exquisite. I mean, obviously they're larger than life size. They're not to scale, but they're so beautiful. And my mother made so many of them in this picture because she loved these bees. Next picture, please. In 1944, the Red Army came through the village of Grabówka. The tide of war had turned and the Red Army was pushing the Germans back, moving westward. And so they liberated the village of Grabówka. And after that, after a month or so, my mother decided to go back to Mniszek to see if anyone from her family, any of the Jews of the village, had survived. She went back there. There were no Jews left. And no one knew what had become of the Jews either. But one of her neighbors thought they might have been taken to this concentration camp, Majdanek, which was in the city of Lublin. So my mother decided to go to Majdanek to see if she could find any signs of her family. And you can see her at the bottom of the picture in her yellow dress, looking so innocent. And the camp had been liberated by the Russian and army and Polish army, and they were stationed there. So they gave her a tour of the camp, and for the first time she saw what had happened to the Jews during the war. She saw the gas chamber and the crematorium, and at the top of the picture, this field of giant cabbages, which had been planted on a bed of human ash. And after she got the whole tour, she joined the army herself, the Polish army, and went with them to Berlin. She was 17 years old. Next picture, please. So after the war ended, my mother went back to Poland from Germany to get Manya, and the two of them then went back to Germany to the American zone and to a DP camp there, a displaced persons camp. And that's where my mother met my father, and my aunt met her husband. They all got married there. There were so many weddings in this camp. My father had relatives in the United States, so they applied to immigrate to the United States. And here we arrive. I was born in Belgium, kind of along the way. My father went there for work, and they lived there for a couple of years before we came to the United States. And we were greeted there by one of my father's cousins who helped sponsor us. Her name was Clara. We called her Heike. And while we were standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, Clara turned to me. She looked at me and she said, "My dear child, this will be your America." And of course, this is the symbol of freedom and refuge for survivors of the war, of the Second World War, and for refugees and immigrants of all countries of the world and over many generations. So I asked my mother, when she did this picture, I asked her what it meant to her to see the Statue of Liberty. And she said, it meant to me that I would never have to hide my Jewish identity ever again. Next picture, please. So this is the backyard. This is kind of a little coda to the story. This is the backyard of our first house in Brooklyn, New York. And my mother, if you go to the next slide, you can see her up in the tree. She's passing buckets of sour cherries down to us, if you go back to the full picture. My mother, who was in fact a great, great cook, she saw this neglected tree full of sour cherries, and she saw blintzes and compotes and pies and all kinds of delicious treats. So she would climb the tree every summer, and she would pick the cherries and send them down in buckets to me and my sister who were waiting there. And in the caption to the picture, she recalls that when she was a little girl, she used to sit with her grandmother, her Bubba, and her grandmother would say, "Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America, because in America, money grows on trees." And she would say, "But Bubba, I'm really good at climbing trees." So every time she climbed this sour cherry tree, she would remember this time sitting and talking with her grandmother. Next picture, please. And next. This picture was actually inspired my mother to want to create a series of family portraits. After my father died, my mother was still working on all her other pictures, but after my father died, she took all his old ties and she cut them out and created this collage. And then that she created this portrait of him as my father, as he looked in his passport picture when we came to the United States. And this just stands as a memorial to him. And she made 3 of these pictures. This one she gave to me. She made one for my sister and a 3rd for my father's sister, who was still living then in Jerusalem. And I think doing this made her think about doing other family portraits. Next slide, please. But this was the only one that she got to finish. This picture of her first grandchild, my daughter, Rachel, who was then about 3 years old. And in this picture, the caption, she describes how she came to visit, and she she never forgot the expression on my daughter's face as she looked up into this tree. But in this picture, she addresses my daughter directly. She is speaking to her. She calls her my dear Mommy Shana, which was her term of endearment for my daughter. And then the last sentence in the caption, she says, "Grandma loves you so much." So it's just filled with her great love. And so for me, although obviously there are so many other pictures in the series that she did that are so emotional, this one for me is the one that is most emotional for me because I hear my mother's voice. But this picture, all the pictures were made out of love, for great love for the family that she lost, for the family that she created. And so after my mother died, if you go to the next slide, after my mother died, my sister and I created Art in Remembrance to share this legacy of love and art and memory by creating the traveling exhibition and also creating the film and the book that I hope you'll get to see. You can find all of this on our website, which is listed here. Because she never envisioned that this work would be seen by other people outside of her family, but it was so clear that it earned an audience outside of the family. So we've been using her art to inspire other people, many of them immigrants, to tell their own stories of loss, leaving life and home behind and coming to the United States to make a new life for themselves. So I hope you go to our website and you can learn more about what we've been doing. And if you have any other questions beyond those that we can answer here, please feel free to email me. I've given my email address there. I want to, before we go on to Q&As though, I want to reintroduce Cecile Lipworth and give her a chance to tell something of how she came to Art and Remembrance and Esther herself.
Thanks, Bernice, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to Tully for inviting us to be a part of this incredible presentation. I am a South African. My mom and my sister are watching this evening, so hi. But I've been living in America as an immigrant since 1997. And I met Bernice, I don't actually know when, many, many years ago. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Bernice has a summer home here. She comes here for the summer. And I met Bernice through a colleague from work and went to see her give a presentation here at the shul, at the Chabad shul here. And was just blown away by the story of Esther's story, but also of her art. And I went to King David from grade 1 to matric. And I think what really intrigued me in the beginning was that at school, we were always shown all these black and white photos of the war. And I didn't ever give a thought to what the color would look like in the war, during a war. I had always just imagined it was this traumatic black and white effect. So when I saw Bernice's mother's artwork, when I saw Esther's art, it really showed as the one picture does, the dichotomy of the beauty of where people are living and the horrors of what people are going through. And as an immigrant, I'm a very passionate feminist activist, but also an activist all around for social justice. Santa Fe, New Mexico is a very big immigrant community from Central and South America, from Mexico. And so the immigrant story was very close to my heart and also to the work that I was doing and seeing how immigrants were treated and how they were reflected. And so in 2016, actually, Bernice and I brought the images exhibition. There's an exhibition of incredibly detailed, highly scanned photos of all the work. We brought it to a gallery here in Santa Fe. And we also invited immigrant communities to do workshops, make their own story cloths. And then we hung those story cloths alongside Esther's artwork as well. And when we did that, it made me think about my own story of immigration, obviously. And I have had a very privileged story. I have been very privileged in everything I've done in my immigration. I haven't had a hard, difficult time. But the stories that the feeling inside of me and listening to these immigrants who had fled violence and horror and crossed borders. We had one little boy who'd come across with a coyote who'd brought him across, and he did his picture of him coming across the border. That story of leaving our families behind, that we all missed our homes, that we all drew pictures and depicted our homes the way Esther had, that was really a point of connection for me to my community. And I think it's inspired me to get more involved and to really understand the immigrant experience that isn't similar to mine. And so politically, we have a huge schism here in America around immigration, I think the world over. But when you begin to understand who immigrants are and how leaving their families and what that means and how that connects us rather than anything else, for me, that's the starting point for reconciliation or restoration or humanity. And that's where we have to begin. And so Esther's art has really meant a lot to me in my own journey. And so I now sit on the board of Art and Remembrance and have been working with them to redo the website. So you're looking at a website that's actually in the midst of being redone, so we can really highlight how beautiful and exquisite Esther's artwork is. And so I just thank Bernice for that opportunity to be a part of it. And again, to bring it to South Africa, to this audience, is really important for me. So I'm very grateful. Thank you.
And we're, of course, very grateful to Cecile for many things, but including making this connection this evening for this program. So if there are any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for that incredible presentation. Thank you both for making it possible to share that work with us and your mother's story. I had a question. I have a few questions, but I thought I would start off, and I see there's a question about the size of the artworks, because I wanted to know that too, and I also wanted to know how long she spent on each of those depictions. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the size and how long they took her to create.
Yeah. Some of them are very large. I think the first one and a couple of others are about 4 feet by 4 feet, roughly. The smallest are maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, with many in between. The amount of time she spent on each varied, but I figure she did roughly 34 pictures over roughly a 10-year span. So roughly, on average, it took her about 3 to 4 months for a piece. But again, as I said, it varied. But one thing to keep in mind is that all the time that my mother was working on these pieces, she was running a business. So she was creating this work in her spare time, in the evenings, and mostly in the evenings, because she had the store open 6 days a week, and on the 7th day she was cooking for me and my family. So she was quite a prodigious worker, and she worked amazingly fast and amazingly precise.
Mm.
I see a question in the chat box. Where are the artworks now? They're all at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, which is fairly close to my home. The museum is now open, so reopened, and they'll be there. They're there on a long-term loan. So as of now, they're scheduled to be there till early 2024. We may extend the run. So if you yourself are planning to come to the United States sometime in the future, or you have friends or relatives who live here, I would certainly encourage them to come and see them, because in person, they're just stunning, really stunning, because of their size and the detail of the work. You know, the exhibit was a few years ago, was at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, DC. And while it was there, this boy, again, another very insightful boy, he said, "I love these pictures." He said, and his mother asked him why, and he said, "Because I can see Esther's hand in them." The stitching, I think the fact that they were tactile, so tactile, it gave him a sense of the person, not like paint or pencil or something. He had a sense of the person behind the picture.
Bernice, do you want to maybe just also mention that you went back to Poland with your mom, and then when you went back to the Galicia Museum, because I think that's really interesting that your mom went back to see the country.
Yeah. After my father died, he had been sick for several months. And so when he passed, my mother was suddenly kind of was able to reclaim a part of her life. And she just wanted to go to Poland. She just wanted to go to Poland. And when I said, "Where do you want to go?" She said, "I just want to see Mniszek." I had been to Poland. I think at that point I had been there a couple of times for work. And so I told her about my experiences there. So she just became very curious, but also that sense of wanting to go home, to see her home. So we organized this, what turned out to be a big family trip. My sister, my kids, my aunt, her husband, one of her kids, and a couple of other cousins. And we went to Mniszek. I mean, we went to Warsaw and we went to Krakow, but we went to Mniszek. That was where she wanted to spend most of her time. And I had told her before we went, I had said, "Well, what if Mniszek isn't there anymore?" And it took her aback. And she said, "I'm sure Mniszek is still there." But she called the mayor of this little town next to Mniszek and told him we were coming. He was very hospitable and welcomed us. And she said, "My daughter said that maybe Mniszek isn't there." And he said, "Oh no, Mniszek is still there." And she was vindicated, so we could go to Mniszek. But when we got there, it was hard for her to recognize. As poor as it had been when she was growing up there, it had really declined even further. You know, people had, well, first of all, there were no Jews there, so there was a shrunken population, and after 50 years of communism, the land wasn't tended, it wasn't farmed very much. The river, that beautiful river that she remembered right by her house, it was turned into a swamp. Really, it was so distressing for her to see. And she was reminded, you know, that I had said maybe Mniszek isn't there. And she realized that the Mniszek that she knew was not there anymore. But we went to the village, Grabovka, where she survived during the war. And there we saw people, women who were girls with her, who remembered her with great love and affection. And I think that kind of brought her back to life, to see the place that had saved her. So it was a very mixed and incredibly emotional experience, if you can imagine, to be there. My husband and I got a small grant several years ago to come to Poland. Before that, just a year or two before that, the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow had an exhibit of these very high quality photographic images that Cecile mentioned. It was beautifully displayed and had tremendous reception. And then they started traveling. After that summer, they started traveling the exhibit, and I got a grant to show our film in some of the places in the vicinity of my mother's home that had the exhibit or were having the exhibit. And that was an incredible experience. We actually managed to kind of retrace my mother's footsteps through these villages that she went to until they came to the village of Grabovka and Dąbrowa and all these places. I got to see them for myself and to talk to people who were living in, well, at least a couple of these places, who knew nothing of the history of their town before the war. I mean, Jewish life was eradicated and they knew nothing of it. They had no history from that time. And they felt like we were bringing their history to them. It was just an incredible, incredible experience.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bernice. I see there's a question from Tali just regarding the process of creating these artworks and particularly about the captions. Could you tell us a little bit more about the captions and where did the caption come first and then the artwork, or were they the last things that were added to the piece?
Yeah. After my mother, so as I mentioned, I saw these works in progress because we had dinner with my parents every weekend. And so after dinner, we'd clear the table and my mother would show me the piece that she was working on. When she finished the piece, when I saw the finished piece, she would say, okay, now help me write this. She would tell me what she wanted to add the caption. She wanted to tell the story. So I helped her. My mother was not educated in English. Her spelling was completely phonetic. So she would tell me what she wanted to say. We'd work on it together. And then I would write it out for her. And she would I would write it out for her actually on tissue paper. And then she would use that to trace the words onto the fabric. And so that part was kind of a collaboration, but it was her story. I'd say, what do you want to say about this piece? And then she would tell me.
And I wanted to ask whether any new stories came out of this process. You mentioned right at the beginning that she told you stories of her life all the way through, but I wondered whether the process of creating these artworks maybe brought out new stories for her or brought out stories for you that you perhaps hadn't heard or hadn't been told yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there were new stories that came out. And it was really interesting because even stories that I might have heard bits of, she developed further when she was creating these pieces. The story that really sort of stuck with me that I heard, she actually never did a picture of. And it was such a incredibly compelling story. she told the story of how one day, when the river was flooding, a Polish farmer was crossing the river, and he started to cross the river. There were 2 German soldiers standing at the entrance to the bridge over the river, and the floodwaters were too high, so he turned his horse and wagon back. But seeing what was happening, these 2 German soldiers forced him at gunpoint to keep going. I mean, it was just the sheer pleasure of watching someone die. So he went across the bridge, and sure enough, the floodwaters swept him off the bridge. But on the other side of the river, another German soldier stood. And when he saw what was happening, he took off his boots and jumped in the water and saved the farmer, pulled him out. I thought, what an incredible story. What an incredible story in the middle of war, and in the middle of the war and I've used that story to point out to kids that every person has within them the capacity for good and evil. And the challenge for human beings is to find the good and bring that to the forefront. I wonder what my mother would have, if I had heard that story sooner, I would have urged her to make a picture of it, and I wonder what it would have looked like.
A wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that with us. If anybody else has any questions, thank you for answering all of my questions. And if anybody else has any questions, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. I just wanted to read some of the wonderful messages in the chat for you, Bernice, and just people are saying thank you so much. What a treat. Such a meaningful presentation, wonderful presentation. Just an incredible way to share your mother's story. Beautiful artworks. Just lots and lots of wonderful comments, which I will send to you after this event as well, so that you can see those. So really just opening up the floor. If anybody else has a question or a comment, I can't see everybody, so you're welcome to just unmute yourself. Oh, I have a question here from Jennifer saying, have you considered writing your mom's diary or story, I presume? Have you considered writing that down? I know you mentioned you started.
Yeah, when I was 10. Well, we have a book, Memories of Survival, which is largely a picture book, but I've added in the book a little bit of additional narrative to the text that my mother, her captions. I have considered writing a book, amplifying her story, but in some ways, her story, or her telling of her story in this particular way, in this combination of art and narrative, is the most perfect way for her. It was the most perfect way for her to tell her story. And so I could elaborate on it, but her way, I think, is the right way. I have one question that people often ask me is whether I inherited my mother's talent for stitching. And I say that my mother's talent was to create these pictures, and mine was to bring them out in the world. So I feel like what we've been doing with Art Remembrance in creating the film, creating the book, creating the exhibit, creating both exhibits, doing these programs, using her artwork to inspire other people to tell their stories, that's the creative part for me. And I feel like sharing her story so widely is the most important thing for me, rather than writing the rest myself.
And I would just add that the film, the 30-minute film of which you all saw the trailer at the beginning, is definitely worth watching for to amplify the story that Bernice has just told, because you hear Esther talking about her own images. And also there's a lot of commentary there's a psychologist to give some commentary on how she used nature, how she used her stitching, how she really, your mother obviously didn't consciously think about all of that, but as we want to do with psychology, to dive into the depths of her mind. But it is a very fascinating narrative that adds and amplifies the works of Esther. To watch the film, and it's 35 minutes on YouTube. You can watch it. So
yeah, you can get to it through our website.
Yeah.
Okay, and I see Danny's shared that link in the chat, so we can all find that. There was just one last comment or question that I saw from Mervyn, who, again, I think picking up on what you just mentioned, Cecile, he talks about how the pictures reflect such strong, solid images, example, the trees. And he wondered what Holocaust network, and that word landslide, I'm not sure what that means. Landslide. Does that mean network?
It means that people that came from your similar background.
Okay. And just asking what she found in America that sustained her after her move.
I think that's really a very interesting question to ponder. I think that her family was always most important to her. And so what she found in America was family. She married, she had a baby, then she had another child. And so in terms of landslide or countrymen, there were some here that she met or re-met, in some cases, people who had immigrated when she was a small child. And that it sustained her because it meant that the life that she once knew still had flickers of existence. And then I guess about 10 years after we arrived, she brought my aunt and my aunt's family, her sister Manya, to America. And she found them an apartment 2 doors away from ours. So she was reconnected with family, with her close original family again. And all of that helped. But I think what really helped was the feeling of having a future, that she had children, that she had opportunity in America to have a life that was robbed, of which she was robbed living in Poland. And that was what really sustained her.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope that someday, we've talked about this a little bit with Tali, but I hope that someday we'll be able to bring the art and story back to you in the form of an exhibit, workshops, programs, other kinds of programs, so that you can, I think, dig more deeply and experience more deeply Esther's art and story, because I think for young people, well, for everyone, but especially for young people, it's a very approachable way to understand the Holocaust and its ramifications for the world in which we live today. And in South Africa, I think, there's a whole other layer in South Africa because of your own history. So dealing with dealing with anti-Semitism and the whole practice of demonizing other people and turning them into the other, I think is so important to understand and
learn from.
and come to terms with. So let me, if I can, I just want to, before we all leave, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you, and to Tali especially, and to Kath for doing such a fantastic job of moderating, but to everyone for joining me in this program.
And from us to you, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I think everybody here would be so thrilled if you could bring those artworks or those photographs to South Africa. And as you say, I can imagine using them with school groups to really, really effective way and to make those connections. So I will look forward to that. Everyone is just saying, thank you so much. What a special treat, something to look forward to. So really, thank you from all of us here in South Africa. Thank you very much, both to you, Bernice, and to Cecile. Just a reminder that next week we do have another webinar, and that will be touching on the subject of the genocide in Rwanda, and in fact, so post-Rwanda, post-genocide. So the title is Gestures of Reacceptance in Post-Genocide Rwanda, Welcoming Former Prisoners Home, and that will be presented by Dr. Holly Nisenthal Krinitz. There is the link in the chat, so that's something to look forward to next week. But from all of us here, thank you so much for this evening's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.